So it is 1400s here in our little town, and at this point the Europe is having their start of their Renaissance. So there is big age of discoveries, and there's a rise in the English language from being modern English, from the Middle English that we were currently speaking. There are public banks, Scotch whisky, wood cutting paintings, and the Christopher Columbus at the end of the century finally arrives in the Americas. So here in England, it is a golden age for labour, and the land has become markets where we've got landlords, and they adopt different systems and more leasehold systems, so they're renting out their land to different people, more for housing this time rather than last century, which was more about the people who worked on the land. And these rents are going up, so it makes it harder for lower income families to kind of get a little house or rent a room where they are. And there's a few towns, especially in the north, that have really developed, like Halifax, Leeds, Suffolk and the Cotswolds, and this is because of the increasing wool industry that was starting last time, but it has increased significantly now here in the 15th century. Writing of history in this sort of century has declined, and kind of there's been no superior works of philosophy or theology as well. It's kind of a really like dull point in British history, and there aren't any noteworthy poets either that have succeeded Chaucer, and someone has set up a press in England in 1476 to publish English works, because they were mainly just published in Latin by the church, and the population has begun to read a little more than they have done. So over this 100 years, there will be a lot of different rulers, starting with Henry IV and ending back with the Tudors. We get the beautiful lots and lots of wars between the Welsh and the Scottish, and obviously the 100 Years' War that Henry goes on, and obviously at the end of this century the whole War of the Roses as well, which was always a fun point in history. So in 1403 there was a guild set up. These are my random facts of the century. A guild of stationers was founded for newspapers and stationery makers, so they could have a society and gather together. In 1415, that was the beginning of the 100 Years' War with France. We sadly lost this. And why did we go to war for 100 years? In 1440, Henry the Sixth founded Eton College, it's the school in Windsor, in the village of Eton, that's famous. And in 1441, King's College in Cambridge was also founded. In 1444, there was a fire at the old St Paul's Cathedral, as that burnt down the old one at some point in the Great Fire, and they had to rebuild it. So that was the old one. And there was a lot of infighting as well between all the Parliament and the courts and the royal courts and the kings and stuff, so there was a bit of a turmoil. In 1455, that was the earliest known reference of knitting in the UK. If you didn't know that, you do now. And in 1459, that was the start of the War of the Roses. In 1468, that was the first recorded record of the rack being used to torture. So that's always good. And in 1472, York Minster, the big cathedral that's in York, was complete, and that took them about a century to build. And in 1478, the first book was printed in Oxford, and obviously went on to make the Oxford Press. In 1486, the word football was first used to describe someone kicking a ball in a muddy field. And in 1489, gold sovereign was used for the first time as currency here in the UK. And in 1495, the Pass of Treason Act was enforced, and this was actually enforced until 2008, so only 10 years ago. And that would mean that if you did anything against the state, you could be done for treason, and you could be hung and put in prison, all sorts of stuff like that. And it was also when the world's first dry dock was made there in Portsmouth, and that would obviously start the British dominance of sailing and stuff around the country. So the architecture in this early part of what I'm calling the Tudor era, we get to the Tudor family by the end of the year, after all the wars. The style was the final development in the medieval architecture, so that was kind of nearer the end. It spanned from 1485 to about 1603. So common features of the Tudor architecture is the decompressed arch, or the four-centered arch, which is the arches that you can see in the buildings where they span up, curve really wide into the roof of the building, and create the arch inside of it. And it has a very low hanging arch pinnacle with a really wide style, and it has a pointed apex right at the top of the arch, giving it its classic shape. And it has the impression of being much shorter than it is, and being because of all the pressure that it has to load from the roof and stuff, because it's wider than it is tall, so it kind of looks a bit stunted. Typically houses were timber framed, especially if you were a normal person and not a king or a queen or anything like that. So the classic timber frames, with the frame was filled with wattle and dowel, and occasionally it would be brick. And over the next 2 centuries, which we will see in the next evolution of our little town, that they started to use brick as well. So most of the smaller houses were rectangular or square in shape, with floor plans, so they were all quite small, and not as lavish as the ones that they were building at the end of the century. And from these houses they retained a sail flat H shape, some of the farm buildings, so they were kind of more had the framework of a H inside, so you could actually see that in the beams and stuff. They would also have steep pitch roofs, which would either have thatch, especially on the outskirts of the towns and stuff, and they would progress into having slate tiles, and sometimes they would have clay, but this was very rare for people to have that. More like upper class and the gentry and stuff might be able to afford the clay roofs. In some of the farm buildings they would have a crack or a crook frame, so this had a stone base of a square stone base, and then they'd build the timber out into a little arch, and then they'd have a little triangular bit at the top to make the roof and hold the roof structure and the walls together, so it looked a little bit like an A, a curved A. The predominant cross, they had predominant cross gables as well, so on the houses they've all gone to the what we would consider more normal roofs. So the gable part of the roof is the triangle section of wall where you see the in between little roof bits on either end. So these were becoming more common instead of the round, more like square roofs that we were seeing in our town. And a lot of the doors and windows were really tall and narrow and didn't really let in a lot of light either. And it was only still the very rich and the church who could afford to have glass in them. They were mainly had just shutters on the windows with wooden bars to kind of keep anyone from climbing in through them. But as we get later on into this architectural style, they do actually start casting lead to put around the windows so they could obviously fit in panes of glass and stuff like that. They had a lot of dormers windows on their roofs as well, so they obviously, as the population picked back up again, because the population dropped considerably at this time because of the plague, so they started at about 5 million. This dropped down to nearly 2.5 million and kind of picked back up again to 4 million at the end of this time period. And this was because of the Black Death, which was mistakenly thought that it was brought over by rats, but it was just the amount of people travelling about. So it passed really well, and it was a quick spreading disease and killed a lot of people. So even though at this time period that would have been quite a significant amount, considering it wasn't actually that much of a population loss, and there was also an agricultural depression at this time as well, so there was a lot of different things happening. And going back to the houses, as in our earlier towns we were having sort of open fires on the floor, we kind of progressed to having proper fireplaces, but they still would have been open. And if you were a gentry or a king or something, you'd also have an oven as well. So they were kind of bringing in that technology. It was still kind of an open fire with sort of metal work around to like cook your hog and stuff by turning it over the fire, but it was still classed as an oven. There was more emphasis on wooden stairs as well, especially for the middle class and gentry, and we'll see soon a version of that where they've got an upstairs and a big entrance hallway that they could meet people and stuff in. So we were progressing up to having lots of different levels with all different types of classes all in the same house. And they would also start making little outhouses as well for toilets and things, because they didn't have any like insides. But this would be mainly the middle class and the gentry as well. There wasn't that much landscaping about at this time. There was kind of barely anything done at the front of the house especially, but some people did have some small herb gardens at the back if they had any space, but kind of buildings were kind of crammed in at this point and trying to utilize as much space as they can. Going up rather than going outwards was the main thing at this point. And the poorest classes used to live in houses called hovels. So this is not like the modern term of a hovel. It's a small one-roomed whittled and down hut, and it would only have one room in it, so that would mean they would sleep, eat, cook, do everything all in that one room, but it was super cheap. And they would also have progressed over this sort of 100 years to having upper floors as well. So they would have a room in the top rafters of a house for them to live in. And the houses kind of were built so the ground floor was about 2 feet up from the pavement. Obviously everyone was a lot shorter in that day, so they didn't have to build the roofs and stuff as high. So then they had the upstairs part project away from the house itself, and this was known as a jetty. This would have molds and freezers underneath that were made of oak, and they could be done in all different sorts of patterns, or they could just have the classic little wooden stumps and stuff that you see everywhere. And the churches were still in the Gothic style, but they were kind of more elaborate. England was really leading the way with their church designs, and they would obviously have their stained glass window. They now also had buttresses at the top of them as well, which we saw earlier in the video, and they also had arches and have whitewashed the insides as well, making quite a clean and holy place inside. So later on in this sort of early Tudor part, we get buildings like Hampton Court Palace and Sutton Palace, and sort of more of the palaces that actually were made from brick and stone masonry. And we'll probably see an example of this in our next adventure to our little village. Perhaps we'll have a king decide to come and stay near the village, so he'll have to build himself somewhere to stay. And at this point we can actually class our little town as having a high street. So this would be a long strip like we've got here, and you can imagine that our church is right at the other end of it, and the road would lead all the way down directly to it, as this would be the focus point of people's Sundays and everydays basically. So it would be the main focal point in the town, and all the houses that would lead up to it that kind of get progressively bigger as they got there. Obviously there'd be the odd big house like out in the country or something, which would be like the Lord's manor or the king's sort of palace, but they started off small and then got a lot bigger. It was the start of proper shops as well, and they would have houses above them, and or maybe the people who own the shop lived above them. So we'd get bakers, doctors, cobblers and banks and all sorts of new different things as well. We'd also have our inn and our tavern as well. They would be combined in sort of free houses for people to stay while they were travelling. Our knight's house has changed into where the guild hall is. So that means that people would go there and register their land, and if they've got any marriages or anything like that, and sort of pay their taxes from there. So it kind of becomes a central hub, and that is where our market cross is as well. So that's a little structure outside, and that's where all the traders come and sell their goods from the different villages around. And they would also have people in the stocks there if they'd broken any laws or anything like that. Our town would progressively get bigger over the century. In the next part you may even see them get a town gate, so this would protect them against anything. They could also keep control of how many people go through the town as well. And in this house here a merchant lives, so he actually has 3 floors to his house. He has a basement in which he can keep all his products, so he's importing wine and beer from the continent and storing it under his house. But however, he doesn't realize that he is actually, because he is near the river and there is an infestation of rats in the cellar, and he is helping to cause the spread of the Black Plague. So he has to be careful of his family from getting the plague. And luckily for him, a doctor lives upstairs in the part of the house that's in the same building as him, so they could obviously go get some leeches or some smelling salts to ward away the plague, even though that probably wouldn't help whatsoever. But merchants and noble people and gentry would have basements to put and store all their different things. And obviously our town centre is becoming less and less green space. It's becoming more built up. We've got proper pathways and everything now, and through few less trees. It's becoming a little bit more dirty as well, as people are throwing their waste and stuff, especially the poorer people, just out into the street. So it's becoming a bit of a disease-ridden place, and also would smell probably horrific. But I'll leave you here with a little tour through our town, and we can see how it's changed over this century.